I want to introduce Greg White, Thunderbird alumni from 2004. Greg, thanks so much for joining us today. So Greg's part of the TGAN, the Thunderbird Global Alumni Network, and he's presenting today on Demystifying Access and Entry to Strategy Consulting Role. So Greg, welcome. Thank you everybody for joining. If you want to save questions till the end, or if you want to interject, Greg, whatever works better for you, like we mentioned, but I'm going to pass it over to you to hop on in. And again, thanks so much for joining.
Great. Thanks a lot, Matthew. Really appreciate the invitation and having the opportunity to speak to some, I hope, some current students and some alumni, maybe even some faculty and staff. All are welcome. Hope you'll enjoy today's session, and feel free to invite others to view this later. What I want to do is we're going to spend about an hour today, maybe a little less. I'm going to spend about 45 minutes presenting. And what I suggest is let's try to let me get through the presentation where I'll cover most of the key points. If something comes up while I'm talking, just shoot me a message on the screen in writing, and I'll try to incorporate a response while I'm presenting. Otherwise, just hold questions till the end. We'll do a little Q&A at the end, so you can jot your questions down as we go through. I'm pretty flexible though, and I would like it to be a discussion. So if we get a little bit sidetracked on a topic that's of interest to the group, that's also okay. I've only put together what I would call a discussion guide. Most of this presentation is going to be kind of voiceover anyway. So I believe that the topic broadly is going to be of interest, but the specific points that I'm planning to talk about, feel free to jump in and let me know if there's something you want me to expand on or anything like that. And then in any case, we'll save time at the end. So yeah, let's jump in. I'm not going to spend too much time telling you about myself. My understanding is that this presentation will be available both in hard copy as well as a recording. So you can kind of read through this, but I will just tell you a little bit about myself. And I think the most important thing is that I personally entered strategy consulting. I joined at the time a company called Booz Allen Hamilton, but in the Middle East, in Dubai. They're obviously a very well-known consulting company here in the US. Just prior to the separation of their strategy consulting arm, which became known as Booz & Co. And then the majority of the time that I worked there, it was Booz & Co. So that was, and this is, the key parts of my profile from that perspective, and for today's discussion, is that I had, at that time, I had around 12 years of work experience and an MBA, BA and an MBA from Thunderbird, but had not done work specifically in strategy consulting before. So I'd done what I broadly would call management consulting, internal consulting for a corporate, but I had not done strategy consulting work, what you would traditionally call that. So I was what you would call an industry hire, and that's at least part of what I want to talk about. So during my time in consulting, I worked with and dealt with and interviewed industry hires. But I was also taking part in interviewing both BAs, MBAs, selecting interns, weighing in on intern performance. And then as a project manager, I was, of course, my performance was judged, and I was involved in the processes for judging the performance of my team. So I do have primarily the perspective of having been an industry hire, but I was involved in hiring and recruiting processes for all different types of hires. So I can certainly speak very clearly from my own experience to the industry hire topic, and as well as many of the other manners of entry. And I think for the typical T-Bird, MGM or MBA, we, at least at the time I was at Thunderbird, we tended to be a little older on average than the average entering class of MBAs in the United States. Somewhere between 5 and 8 years of work experience rather than 2 to 5 at other programs. And so at the time, I was a little bit on the older side, still in my 20s, but late 20s. And but with the MBA, I'll come to some of the key parameters. But that's the reason that I feel. First of all, I think it's an interesting topic, and I've had the debate and the discussion on these topics many, many times, just with people in my network and people interested in strategy consulting, normally over a beer, but happy to put a few slides around it and have a discussion here. And I think it will be helpful. Normally the feedback I get is that at least people learn something new. Maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not, but I think it's one of those interesting and somewhat exclusive industries where it's just fun and interesting to get an insider perspective, I hope. So I will, lastly on this page, just take a moment to mention I have worked for large global corporates across my career, primarily in transportation and logistics. Only one company, Ports America, I was chief commercial officer there, was a purely US based and US focused company. All the rest of the companies I worked for had international components. And in my roughly 25 years working, I spent about 18 of those years working overseas in different markets, which is just rounds me out as probably a typical T-Bird profile. But it was a little bit unique as an MBA coming in strategy consulting as an industry hire. So happy to take more questions on my own background in the Q&A. And I'm later going to invite you all to be in touch with any questions or follow-ups you have, and happy to talk about any topics from my background if that's helpful. So let's move on. What is it that we're talking about today? So what is strategy consulting? Why is it attractive to T-Birds with MGMs, to MBAs in general? Which firms are in focus? What do we consider to be blue chip, top tier, second tier, specialty, et cetera? We'll talk a little bit about that. And then the crux of our topic today is what strategies can be deployed to both gain access, hopefully to gain entry, to what is sometimes a difficult to penetrate industry. And as I mentioned, we'll save some time for Q&A at the end. If there is anything broadly in this topical area that you also want to address, just shoot a message or bring it up in the Q&A. So what is strategy consulting? I think if you're on this webinar, you already have a perspective on that, or at least you're interested to learn more. And I did a little desk research on this to see what comes up when you Google these kind of topics, which I thought was interesting. And what you'll find here is I borrowed a little from some things I found, but I also made the content my own. So this is what's presented here is what I personally feel strategy consulting is versus management consulting. Same thing with the upsides and the downsides of working in this industry. So typically in strategy consulting, you are advising CEOs or C-suite or board or owners. In the government sector, there is strategy consulting in the government sector as well, and then it's the senior most members of government or those functional departmental areas that you're advising, and they are typically looking for strategic direction, strategic planning. They do consider your advice to be differentiated in that it is unbiased, or hopefully is unbiased. Typically, you're called upon because of your experience in the sector, the industry, or with that specific type of problem. And I know that kind of sounds nice, but isn't that kind of subjective? And the answer there, I think, sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes if you as a very good salesperson in strategy consulting, if you have good relationships with C-suite people, with board members, et cetera, you'll get work even if you aren't necessarily the leading guy or company in a specific industry segment or with a specific problem. However, in more cases, so in my view, in the majority of cases, you must evidence that you are an expert in a specific area in order to be called upon to provide advice in that area and to be paid, relatively speaking, very high fees for the advice. And in several of my roles, I have been, a VP of corporate development for 6 years in the Middle East. We underwent a major transformation, and during that time, I deployed strategy consultants and selected strategy consulting firms to help us with the transformation and lots of specific topics. And I can tell you that, if I knew and trusted the leadership, the partner, the principal from the firm, they might have an advantage because I just knew what kind of work I would get out of them. On the other hand, there were topics when I was very specific, requiring what we call qualifications in a topic, in an industry, in a functional area, in order to be qualified to do the work. And we selected the party that had the best qualifications. So I think there's a mix in that respect. I think it's also, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the specific firms and their cultures, as I think that's germane for the conversation. But that broadly covers it, right? And in what is more generally called management consulting, that's either about implementation of the strategy that has been created, or more operational in nature, or more functionally specific in nature. So, for example, IT consulting, or maybe procurement consulting, things like that. But broadly speaking, I think strategy consulting is part of what management consulting is in general. So there is a little bit of interchangeability there, but strategy consulting is a subset that is fairly specific, as I mentioned. At least that's my point of view, and that's what I have found to be the case in my experience. So in terms of attractiveness, I think most of you will have a perspective on that, and that may be why you're here. And I think the same reasons that strategy consulting is what it is, right? That's a lot of what's attractive about it, right? Because you're dealing with high-level leading, organizational leaders, C-suite level, typically owners, boards, advisors, sometimes governments. And that in itself is pretty interesting in terms of just exposure. So that's, it's a very different conversation you're having, as we all know, right? When you stand around the water cooler and kind of talk with, people who are executing day to day on a company's strategy, right? They'll have a certain perspective versus the CEO, the C-suite, or the board members who are thinking about things longer term, thinking about things very strategically, and meanwhile understanding the day-to-day challenges for the staff, but it's always a very differentiated perspective. What's nice about strategy consulting, I think, is when you get to have a little bit of both. So you kind of are working with the senior leaders of the organization, but you may deep dive on a topic and then go down with a functional area with the leadership there and with some of the folks working in those areas to really dig in on a topic. And there you have an opportunity to learn a lot, but also to be an ambassador for kind of what the C-suite is after. And that, I think, is an important part of the role as well. And it forces you to mature. If you can't deal with kind of being part of the strategy and the formulation of the strategy at all levels of the organization, you won't last very long. So I think that kind of leads into the next point, which is about working on some of the most important strategic topics that may be trending or are in any case critical for the industry or the companies that you're working for, because again, strategy consulting is typically relatively costly, and it's only an investment that they make when it is an important topic. So that's always an interesting part, which is attractive. Another element that I think is quite interesting, and it's not always something that people have considered, is what I call the consulting skill set. And we'll talk a little more about that. I'm gonna quiz you guys on a few of those things when we get to that point. But this is there's three core elements to this in my view, right? So the first one is being able to undertake financial modeling. And that is it is a core skill that everyone is expected to be able to do. And generally on a team, whether small or large, everyone gets a turn, and the better you are at financial modeling, the more you are expected to financial model. So it's fun to watch how that plays out within strategy consulting firms and teams, because you tend to get a little bit typecast into that modeling role, and if you want to break out of it, sometimes it's hard to do. But everyone's expected to have the capabilities. Everyone's expected to be able to review a model even if they didn't prepare it. And I'm not only talking about financial statements or long-term financial planning. I'm also talking about market sizing, economic modeling, et cetera, population growth. All kinds of things that you could think about. So that is actually key part of the core skill set. At Booz, there was very intensive training to support not only what is financial modeling and how do you do it, but what is the Booz way? And you'll find that most of the blue chip firms have a similar approach. When you get to sort of the accounting firms, consulting arms, they tend to just bring in their finance teams to do the models, and they leave the strategy consulting to the strategy consultants. But in the blue chip firms, it's an integrated part of your responsibilities typically. So the second part, the second of three, is your PowerPoint presentation skills. And that is done in a couple of different ways. I've seen two models. So one model is that the consultants are expected to basically be PowerPoint wizards, and no one entering, whether they're a fresh hire out of an MBA program or an experienced hire who's worked in industry, no one has that skill set yet properly developed. It takes a couple of projects working 18 hours a day, and you pretty much develop those skills, right? Under the tutelage of your teammates, and also there is also training for that. But the long and short of it is, the better you get at PowerPoint, the faster you are at producing not just content, but high quality content in the right structure, in the right format. And you just can't afford to be slow or inadequate at doing it yourself. And because you're often, I'm gonna come more to this when I get to the downsides, or what I think are the downsides. Because you're often finishing your presentations at 2 o'clock in the morning, 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning, you often don't have anyone else to rely upon to help you with your content, your format, your messaging, et cetera. So it's on you at that hour of the day. Now, the other method for producing PowerPoint content is to kind of outsource it. So I know some firms, they will kind of sketch out what they want to say, and then send a scan or a picture of that over to basically a production facility, is the best thing to call it. It's kind of an outsourced, or even if it's in-house, it's outsourced from the team that's on site at the client, and they'll produce that. You can send them a picture of a chart from a research paper where maybe you don't have a digital copy or a soft copy, you don't have the data, and you can get that production house to reproduce the chart, which you might want to show as part of your research. And I think all firms have a little bit of that when it's just, there's no value add really in the time it takes to reproduce a chart, for example. It's just, it fits nicely into your story, into your message, into basically your hypothesis about what you're proposing. So you need to have it, but it's just a reproduction of something that's there. And you're going to source it, et cetera, but it needs to be in your format and all that. So in those cases, there's typically an in-house production facility that helps. So I can't stress that part enough, because you pay a relatively high amount of money for this strategy consulting support, and you get two things out of that, right? You get the time, attention, and mind share of these smart very in touch with current trends, right? Strategy consulting teams, leaders, and team members. So you get that access for advisory, right? And that can be in the form of ideas. Look at what these guys did, taking ideas from one industry, transferring them to another, thinking about things differently, thinking about things in a me-see manner. I'm going to come back to that. So that's a big part of what you get, and just time with these unbiased but highly intelligent and well exposed consultants. But the other thing you get at the end of your project is a deliverable, which is normally a PowerPoint presentation, right? So that in the end is the result that you can kind of hold on to, that you paid for. And for that reason, those PowerPoint skills they're just exceptionally important, right? Because that is how you encapsulate all the value that you are bringing across. And of course, it's not the presentation itself, right? It's the messages, it's the ideas, it's the strategies. But that's the reason that it's so critical. And then the third part of that consulting skill set is kind of what I call the bedside manner, right? So that's how you deal with organizational leaders, how you deal with members of the organization who may not be in leadership, but whom you may be reliant upon for support. And one of the typical, probably the single biggest challenges that every strategy consulting team faces on every project can be summed up very simply. It's getting access to the data that you need in order to carry out your project work. And you go into the CEO or the board and you pitch what you want to do, you get hired and they say, yes, that's what we want. Before you can really do much, you need to get a significant amount of data from the company. And that is not coming directly from the CEO, right? He puts you in touch with the CFO, or whether it's financial data or market data or sales data, right? You're put in touch with the appropriate functions, but then you need to go in and you need to get the data from them. And despite that the CEO or somebody has given this directive and instruction, it's not always easy. And it's basically, as I said, it's the biggest, often the biggest challenge. Certainly in the beginning, it's the biggest challenge, right? And then, within any organization, you always have, one faction that is for this project, another faction that wanted another firm or wants a different strategy. And so managing something as tactical as just getting the data, but something at the same time, something as important as, keeping the organization aligned to the broader interest here of the company and the strategy that you hope to, develop and deploy. That is a special skill. And it's a lot of that I personally learned just from observing the behaviors of the leadership within the consulting team, the partners, the principal, the project managers when I started. And I think for some people that comes very easy. For some people it doesn't. And I sometimes think about that show House MD, if any of you ever watched that show, and he would sometimes select a certain member of the team to go in and do something which he knew would be difficult for them to push and develop them. He would also sometimes choose someone on his team to go in and talk to a patient or a doctor or whatever, if he knew they'd be very effective in quickly getting it done, right? And I also saw that kind of similar behavior within consulting teams as well. So that's I believe a somewhat, it's not the most often talked about element of what you get from strategy consulting experience, but I think it's among the more important that you take away. But the consulting skill set alone is just an extremely powerful skill set. Anywhere you would go, any deployment you would do, when you leave, you go to the client side, if you go to another firm, if you go into any sort of a corporate situation, it's a very useful way of kind of looking at the world and having at your fingertips the capabilities to prepare models, do analysis, et cetera. So pretty important and from my point of view, very attractive element of spending time in this industry. The last one is the stepping stone advantage. So if you have worked in strategy consulting at all, people who have worked with strategy consultants will have an understanding of and a respect for those kinds of skill sets, right? And it will be helpful to you in any job interview if the person had that perspective. and it will be important to you in almost anything that you're going to do, whether for yourself or in your career. So there's no question that spending some time in strategy consulting is valuable as a stepping stone. The downsides, I think those are also probably pretty clear if you know anyone in the industry or if you've seriously considered it yourself. So very long hours, typically significant travel. The strategy consulting firms, the blue chips at least, they don't care where you live generally, but you will be expected to be on the client site, 4 days a week, if not 5 days a week, depending on the project. And oftentimes, for something of critical short-term importance, like a due diligence for a private equity fund, as an example, I did lots of those. And I would sometimes be there for 3 weeks without going home because it was that intense, and we really needed every moment to meet a deadline. So that's tough. And then in terms of work-life balance, there isn't much. You're expected to put the firm first. That was in my particular case. When I joined strategy consulting, I was single. And at the time I left, which was about 2 years later, I was married and had my first child on the way. And that was, I think, not the first, but probably the second time that I started making decisions about my career and personal life that were not based solely on my own desires, but based on something bigger. So, and that's not to say that there's nobody who's married or has kids that is a successful strategy consultant. Of course, there's lots of people like that, but they don't have a good, what I would call a positive work-life balance. They just don't. It doesn't work to have both. So you have one or the other, basically. So another element, this may or may not be viewed as a downside, but many firms have an up or out policy. So you're either performing well and you're promoted on track, or you are counseled out of the organization is the way they normally term it. And there's actually no shame in being counseled out. It very, very rarely happens within 6 months or a year or something, or shorter. So typically there's a very rigorous interview process, which we're going to talk about, and that is successful typically. So it's more that as you get to a critical promotion period. So one example is when you move from project manager to principal, and these titles are not always the same at all the firms, but you have partner, principal, project manager by various names, but those are the key levels. At principal level, you're expected to start selling work. And that's a key moment when people either conclude, I don't want to sell, or it eventually is concluded that they're not good at selling, right? And so when that is a key element of your, how your performance is appraised, then that's a typical moment when a lot of people leave. So, and then the last point is it's just a high burn rate in general. So it's for that reason, and for other people like myself who just want to, have a better work-life balance, that it's very, very atypical to, start and end your career in strategy consulting. Of course it happens, but there will be hundreds, probably thousands of people who come in and out of a firm or, across firms, compared to the handful of people who start and go through their whole career and end there. It's very rare. And I think it's neither good nor bad. It just means that they accept, they're interested in the attractive element. They accept the downsides, and they're good at selling and ultimately good at networking, and they can flourish. So, all right, let me move on from those key elements, and happy to hear from others toward the end there if I missed on any of the attractive elements or the downsides. So which firms are we talking about? I'm not going to spend too much time here, but I would be remiss if I did not mention MBB, which is McKinsey, Bain, BCG. These are what are often referred to as the blue chip firms, the MBB. I personally consider Strategy and formerly called Booz & Co. to be there. And I also personally consider Roland Berger to be there, but I think why they're typically not there is because they're extremely strong in Europe and not strong in North America. They're strong in Middle East and Africa and Asia, but they are present in North America, but not that strong. Whereas Booz & Co, Strategy, and now I personally think they're there, but I admit I'm biased. A.T. Kearney, people could make an argument there, but they tend to be a little bit more top tier / specialty. So within the rest here, the top tier and the specialty, you'll get an answer as to where does a firm lie that is different depending on who you ask. Although I think the specialty or operational or IT or implementation implementation focused firms, there's less debate about those, I think. So Accenture is a lot of IT and IT implementation. Gartner is pure IT, and they do a lot of research. So it's IT research, and they're famous for their Magic Quadrant, if you're not familiar. Alex Partners and Capgemini and FTI, they do a lot of financial workouts. So bankruptcies, restructurings, that's kind of, Alex Partners is famous for their 13-week cash flow analysis. So very specific, very short term, when you're literally trying to figure out, who do I pay and how much, and how do I come out of this restructuring, financial restructuring, right? Very interesting work. And of course, they do a little strategy work as well, but that's kind of what they do. The guys in the middle, they do a lot of consulting, strategy consulting work or management consulting work. But what I found, I think this is interesting, quick comment, is that what I found is that when I was at Booz & Co, now Strategy and oftentimes when I hired Roland Berger in the past, or I hired McKinsey in the past, they would bring in KPMG or Ernst & Young to help with things like process mapping and process documentation, right? So in other words, if as part of the implementation of your strategy, you want to map your processes and then optimize your processes to just kind of keep it at a high level, you don't want to be paying McKinsey to map processes, right? So you might bring in Ernst & Young consulting under McKinsey, or you might do it separately to execute on that part of the work, and then they kind of work in concert with your strategy guys, and that will cost you significantly less. And so it's a good financial strategy. And moreover, the McKinsey guys, they don't want to do process mapping, right? They'll do it, but it's not really their sweet spot. So yeah, and I think I listed firms that I'm familiar with, where I know at least a few people. In many cases, I know a lot of people. So I can, if anybody has questions on any of those, I can talk to you about it, maybe connect you with someone there if any of those might be of interest to you as part of the Q&A. Okay, let's jump in now to the strategies. So there's a number of different things to think about as you want to target entering this industry. The first thing I would mention, I'm kind of putting this on a 2x2, but keeping it simple. And by the way, the 2x2 analysis is very typical of strategy consulting, so I thought it was a good use of the tool here. And having a BA is basically table stakes, right? So you won't be considered without a BA. That's a starting point, right? So that's kind of the first threshold you have to get over. And happily, this particular audience is all working on a graduate degree at MGM, or maybe already has a graduate degree, or is an alumni, et cetera. So I think we're all well into the next area of focus. But I have literally never met anyone who was at a blue chip firm who did not have a BA. I have met a lot of people without MBAs or master's degrees. However, most of them were bachelor hires or interns. And the model there is very typically to come in as an intern and then go back for the MBA, or come as a bachelor's hire as kind of an analyst for a couple of years, then go back and get the MBA or graduate degree, and then come back. So in general, you don't find anybody without a BA. And I'd say it's 90% of people have a graduate degree. Probably 50% of those are an MBA of some kind. A lot of engineering masters as well. A lot of computer science masters has become more and more popular. I have further up on the continuum here a PhD. In Europe, almost all the consultants have PhDs, or if they get into principal or partnership level, they typically have a PhD or they're working on a PhD. But that's also a little bit different educational model than what we have in the United States. You know, Germany is a large producer of strategy consultants, and the education is free, and a lot of people don't even enter the workforce until, you know, 28, 29, when they already have a PhD and they've not done any work, right? Just research. So not 100% fair comparison to the US market, in my view. But anyway, once you have the BA, the single most important things you can do are get some work experience, hopefully in an industry that is a consumer of strategy consulting work. Get the MGM, what you're doing now for you current students, or the MBA or another graduate degree that's going to be applicable, right? A master's in English or in history, probably less attractive, but if you have the right interview skills, flexibility, and some of these other things, then it actually may not matter as much. But the thing is that the day-to-day work of a strategy consultant matches extremely closely to the MBA or the MGM curriculum. It just does, right? It's finance, accounting, understanding supply chain, understanding how companies are structured, understanding tax, understanding organizational development. Change management is a key component of almost any strategy change. So the organizational understanding and development is critical. So the MBA or the MGM, in the case of Thunderbird, it's just a perfect fit, and that's why there's so many MBAs. I think this is common knowledge, but even having some work experience in an interesting industry, even being completely flexible on where you would go, where you would work, where you might have to live, who you might have to work with, what kind of clients, what kind of team members, even being fully flexible there. If you haven't had an internship in strategy consulting, and or if your interview skills are not stellar, then it's going to be hard. It's just that simple, right? So we're going to spend a few minutes on interview skills coming up, but part of the challenge is just perfecting those interview skills, and that takes time and commitment, right? I kind of had even a continuum in one of my versions here on interview skills needing to have an extremely high commitment to that in order to be successful. But I think attitude is important as well. Languages can be a very, very interesting way to sidestep some of the other elements that are considered. So I'll give you an example. In France, if you cannot both speak French fluently and deliver written work in a highly professional manner in French, you're not qualified to work in strategy consulting in France, in a word. Same applies mostly to Morocco and a couple of the other Francophone countries in Africa. So to turn that around, if you are a well-qualified candidate but haven't been successful in North America or in, name a country, but you speak and read write French perfectly, then you could consider to go to France and try your luck there. That was one of the reasons, I was hired into strategy consulting in Dubai at a time when strategy consulting was really taking off. So that's why I put luck on here. I think luck, timing, right place, right time. I'm not saying I wasn't qualified, I was, but I think that being there at that moment in time when Booz was expanding at the pace, when strategy consulting was expanding at the pace it was in the region at the time, I had better chances than otherwise, right? So as we continue further up the spectrum, market knowledge, obviously important. When you join strategy consulting, you typically join a partner's team in a certain practice. And that certain practice is typically an industry or industries, right? So it might be transportation, which can broadly be public sector, think water taxis and buses and railways and subways, but it would also encompass private sector, 3PLs, logistics, shipping, logistics technology, air freight, all those kinds of things. So that kind of broad practice is where you end up, right? So you're often selected, or you're eligible for selection because of your industry experience, market knowledge within that industry, market presence. So, you know, if you're going to work on projects in Mexico, well then, if you have lived and worked in Mexico, have knowledge of that market, speak Spanish, et cetera, then obviously you're going to be better qualified than someone who has not. It doesn't mean you can't be selected for the role, but of course it's helpful, right? We're here talking about all the things you can do to improve your chances. Thought leadership, is if you can, there's a lot of people, trying to get their ideas out on platforms like LinkedIn. That can be a way to differentiate and get yourself noticed. And then just having a senior network and being a trusted advisor maybe already, whether it's among startups, within the PE or VC space, however you may have developed those relationships, if that can help open doors for the firm, then that can be something considered positively. So let's talk about the interview readiness. I think I'm going to run short on time here, so I'll just try to finish up here in another minute or two. The interview, it's important to have, your application done well, your resume done well. I take those things as a given, but you should, utilize, for the existing students, utilize the CMC for those, for that kind of support. Use your network, use people like me, call on alumni, call on people who currently work in strategy consulting or who have worked in the past, people who are in corporates but hiring strategy consultants, because I can tell you of more than one occasion where a client proposed a candidate to join the firm who we hired because it helped strengthen the relationship with the client. And so again, they have to be qualified, but it's a question of how do people get the roles they get, right? It's through those kinds of networking relationships. That applies here as well. So framing your brand and your content, that comes back also to the structure point there for the case interviews. One of the single most important things in how you present yourself is the structure around which you present yourself, your brand, your story, your content. That should be done in an organized, well thought through manner. It should be more rehearsed than sound colloquial, even if that's uncomfortable for you. That gives the right impression. Think of, come back to those PowerPoint presentations of structure, hypothesis-driven approach, how you present thoughts, ideas. You have to be aligned vertically, horizontally in your physical presentation of content, and the same should hold true in your verbal presentation of content. So do not underestimate that, right? So it's not only how you dress and how you look and how you present yourself and your story, but the structure around which you do so. So for case interviews, it's actually the single most important thing is the structure, right? So there is no right answer to case interviews typically as a generalization, right? That varies, right? You can have some very specific questions where there is a right answer or where your estimate should be within a range. But the single most important thing is that you structure your approach, you structure your ideas properly. And there's always different ways of doing that, but doing it in some form is critical. So I'm not going to go into how to best execute on a case interview. There's lots of resources online. There's even services that will coach you, that will let you practice with them, ex-consultants, which I think is pretty interesting. And it's not expensive. I mean, for less than $100, you can get a coach that will take you through case interviews. And I actually strongly recommend you do so. I did practice case interviews. I heavily did that myself. I did it with kind of friendlies. I did it with current and former strategy consulting people in my network. So I do not underestimate that. Things like financial statement analysis, you've either got it or you don't. But when you finish an MGM or an MBA, you should have it sufficiently. If this is an area that you want to explore, it should be something that you're, dare I say, passionate about. Things like market sizing, I'd be very surprised if you did not receive a market sizing question during your strategy consulting interview process. And again, it's all about how you structure your thinking and your answer, right? The question I got two different questions from two different interviews. One was how many telephone booths are there in Manhattan? Another one I got was how many, or what is the size of the market for cigar cutters in Saudi Arabia? And again, it's not about the answer, right? It's about how you would approach getting the answer. And you got to be as creative as possible, but quick and well structured. On the industry knowledge part, I mean, you shouldn't walk into a strategy consulting interview and not know anything about strategy consulting, right? Just like anything else. So I would be remiss if I did not highlight the term MECE, the term Harvey balls, and the term hypothesis-driven approach. So with a show of hands, and I know I won't see, who knows what MECE means? And you're not allowed to Google it. MECE is a famous strategy consulting term created by McKinsey, which means mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. My wife hates it when I bring up this term when we're having a conversation about something in our social lives. But it is actually highly relevant in strategy consulting. It basically means that you consider all options. So if you're looking at, what should this company do? Well, one of the things they could do is sell themselves. They could also just exit, go out of business, right? So there's always a spectrum across which every strategy has options. And that's one of the things that strategy consultants do well, is to really consider everything, right? Including things you wouldn't, let's say, normally think about in your day-to-day. Harvey balls, I think most of you know what those are. Those are the balls. I should have put an example in, but that's where you have a circle and it's completely filled in, marking a heavy influence, half filled in for some influence and not filled in at all, or a portion thereof. And Harvey balls were invented by someone at Booz Allen Hamilton, whose surname was Harvey. So he was the inventor there. And the hypothesis-driven approach is a methodology for formulating and structuring your content in a strategy proposal, wherein you basically determine a hypothesis for what you think you should do, and then you develop your reasoning and lay out your case on the basis of that hypothesis. It enables you to be focused on what you think is a likely outcome without having to boil the ocean. That's kind of the purpose. And sometimes at the conclusion, you find out that your hypothesis was 100% right, 100% wrong, and more often in some degree right or wrong, which then draws you to strategic options. So it's a very powerful method, very typically used across consulting firms. So as I mentioned here on the resources, application support and resume review, please do not think that you are the single source to review your resume. The CMC was very helpful to me at the time. They will be helpful to you. And use your network for that. Send your CV out to 5 people you trust and ask them to review it. Get after your network to support you in both helping you prepare and also helping you gain entry and access. And consider using one of these resources I mentioned here. I didn't use any of those myself, just for full disclosure. I just did a quick search on those. I do know someone at one of them, and I think they're good. You can invest between $12 and $78, I think. And I would say every little bit helps. So it's something to seriously consider if this is a direction you want to go. All right. How do we do on time? Looks like I'm at exactly an hour, so I did not reserve 15 minutes for Q&A. However, I have extra time available, so I'm happy to devote 15 minutes or a little less, a little more, if there are any questions. So I will open it up to the floor. I'm overwhelmed by the response. Anyone?
Yeah. So my name is Dennis Batame, and thanks for the presentation that you just gave us. There's a lot to, there's a lot to prepare for, and there's a lot that we've got to learn from this session. So I just had a quick question about, practicing for those case interviews. Like, did you guys have a group that you were doing that with, or did you have a team outside of school that you're actually practicing these cases with?
So, great question. In my particular case, I was hired from industry. So I was living in China working for a chemical company. and I wanted to relocate to Dubai with my wife, Hanan Waji, who's also a T-Bird from '05. She was transferring to Dubai with Johnson & Johnson. And so I was not able to transfer, and I started looking for roles in Dubai, and it seemed like a good time to try strategy consulting. So I considered, and I actually interviewed with strategy consulting firms when I was a student, when I was getting my MBA at Thunderbird. But I ended up, I didn't take that all the way till the end. I chose another opportunity that was right for me at the time. But then 4 years later, in the situation I was in when I was transitioning on roles and geographies, I thought it was a good time to try this again. So in my case, I was not a student at the time. I was not in a student environment. So what I personally did was call upon my network, both in Shanghai and in Dubai, but especially in Dubai where I was targeting to be, because my network was better able to, from my point of view, was going to be better able to support that. In general, right? Now, for specific case interview preparation, I think that probably matters a little less, but I would definitely recommend working together in pairs or in teams. And it's interesting if you work with maybe 3 people, one person can sort of deliver the interview, and then the 2 people can work on responses and maybe take turns in responding, or because it just, what's sometimes hard is when you're delivering your response, you're not thinking about what you're doing well and what you're not doing well. So it's good to have an observer. So that if you have the resources available, I think 3 or maybe 4 even is perfect. Because one person kind of delivering the questions, and you, let's say, preparing the answer, and then once you're finished with it, then you get immediate feedback on what you could have done differently, what you could have done better, what you did really well, how you could have maybe structured it differently. And then leading into the next question, you sometimes find out why you could have or should have done it differently, right? Another thing I think I would mention here is that in all the case interviews I ever did in situ, like the actual situation, the interviewer gave me immediate feedback on what I didn't consider, or what I should have considered, or what if I wasn't getting it sort of fast enough, then they would cut me off and say, "This is what I'm trying to get you to. Consider that. Let's go to the next question," right? So they don't let you kind of flounder, and so you have to be very diligent in your practice to that effect as well, right? You don't get 5 minutes to respond to the case interview questions. You get 3 to 5 seconds to think about your answer before you start talking. Then you get kind of 30 seconds to get out of the gate. And if you're going in the wrong direction, they're just going to stop you, right? So thinking about how you want to structure your answer and what you want to do immediately, as your first step in responding, it is the most critical, right? So either you quickly get it or you don't, right? And if you don't tend to quickly get it, you're going to be in trouble. So and I know that's kind of generic in nature, but without having a specific case to go through, it's hard. I could give you a couple of pointers on like a typical case example, if that's of interest to the group. But let me pause there on that answer, and Dennis, let me know if that was helpful. And then if there's other questions, otherwise we could go into a little more detail on a case.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Juliana, and thank you so much for your presentation. I think it was really great and super informative. I'm kind of curious about the interviews as well, and specifically kind of the case studies. And I'd also like to hear about maybe some of the biggest mistakes that you see people making throughout those interviews, especially people coming straight out of a graduate program or really at any level, kind of your experiences that you've seen where people tend to get stuck.
Yeah, sure. It's a good question. The single biggest, I would say, mistake or misstep that I observed, and I think was often discussed amongst the team, after a day of interviews, because we would typically do interviews on Fridays in the home office, or in the Middle East, it was Thursdays. But the final day of the week which is typically an office day. And at the end of the day, you'd often kind of get together and talk about the interviews. And you would do that formally, but you'd also do it informally. And I think the biggest mistake or misstep was simply overconfidence. So, if you, just because you have, if I go back to my continuum, right, just because you've basically checked all the boxes leading up to this sort of second threshold, you've got some great experience, maybe with a great company, you've got the graduate degree, you've shown yourself to be flexible. That whole attitude piece that I have there, kind of sitting on that second threshold, it's very important. And I think I should caveat this with, strategy consultants, you don't survive long if you're not, let's say, above average intelligence, right? I mean, in order to perform well in this kind of situation and this kind of pressure, these kind of hours, this kind of clients, you'll tend to be sort of, above average intelligence, right? And in many cases, you'll have a very strong profile in terms of education, in terms of work experience. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, you can be an arrogant son of a gun. And I think if you're arrogant in an interview, and this holds true for any interview, right, I think, but because there tend to be a lot of arrogant strategy consultants, I think candidates often think that's expected, or it's okay, or, you won't fit in unless you demonstrate that kind of attitude, or I don't know. But I would definitely call that a mistake and a misstep in every case that I ever saw. It's not something you can't recover from, I think, if it came off that way to someone, but not to everyone. But I think that's one of the things, one of the biggest mistakes I saw. If you had a Harvard MBA, that does not mean you're going to be hired. That depends a lot on how you interview, who you are as a person, and think back to not only the consulting skill, the tactical skills in Excel and PowerPoint, but how you act with the client, how you act with your team, that bedside manner. You spend sometimes 16, 18, 20 hours a day with these people. So if you're not easy to get along with, it's going to be a problem, right? And I've seen that happen. So yeah, that's I hope that's an obvious one, but I want to mention it because it was the most common, right? It's pretty uncommon that we had people who were, just unprepared. That was very, very uncommon. So within strategy consulting, the firms already are in a coveted position that they get very highly qualified applicants, and they get a lot of applicants, so they can then even siphon off the really great applicants in order to only interview the stellar applicants, right? So, but that went to the heads of some of the candidates that I saw at times. So, hope that was useful.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I know we're coming up to the end here. I don't know if anyone else has any last minute burning questions or not. And if not, then maybe we could wrap it up. But if anyone has anything real quick they want to say before the end of this call, feel free to speak now. And if not, we can wrap everything up.
I did just notice there's one message that came in through the chat, which I'd be happy to respond to. Let me just read that really quick. Is it true that the entry to a consulting career is where you start as a business analyst and then scale up? Also, I was told that consulting is a discipline similar to being a lawyer, where the more projects you take on, the better you get, and it takes experience and patience. Do you agree? Again, thanks for the wonderful insight, et cetera, et cetera. So, short answer. So let's take this in two parts. The first one is, do you start as an analyst and then scale up? Let's take that first. The short answer to that is yes. If you come in as a BA, as a bachelor's hire, even if you have a year or two of experience, they typically rate you or place you based more on your education at that point. So you typically start as an analyst, right? So, and it doesn't matter if you're a fresh BA, a couple of years experience, maybe you've been an intern. None of that really matters that much. Doesn't matter if you're 23 or 24 or 22. What matters is kind of where are you in terms of your seniority in the firm, right? So at that point, you typically start as an analyst, and that is typically what you're called. And that's entry level in strategy consulting. And from there, you progress, and you may or may not have the upper out. Normally, in most firms, in order to really progress, you have to get a graduate degree. So it's very common that you join as an analyst. Some firms might promote you to a consultant or a similar title, but that's as high as you can go without the graduate degree. So normally it's analyst or consultant, you can't go higher. And then a lot of firms will help or support or at least allow you to leave, meaning they'll financially support you to go back to the MBA or the graduate degree. And other times they'll kind of hold a spot for you if you go and come back. And that kind of depends on your performance and how well the firm is doing and a lot of different variables. And then normally when you come back with a graduate degree, then you slot in at the next level, irrespective. So, and that at Booz, at least, it was called associate. At several firms, it's called associate. And so associate means by definition, you have a master's degree. And that can also happen. So let's say you did a BA and then directly did an MBA. So you might be like, let's say you're 23 with no work experience, but you have the MGM or the MBA. You can come in as an associate, right? And at that pay level, and you're also expected to do more. You're expected to at least be kind of semi-leading projects. And because maybe you're brand new to the firm, they wouldn't put you, they wouldn't have you running a project on day one. But after 2 or 3 projects, they'd expect you to run a team. So that's the big differentiators, is kind of where you are as a BA pre-masters, which is analyst or consultant. And then what happens after the master's degree at associate, most firms then they'll have a term like associate or director and then principal partner. And each of those levels will have, normally they will have 3 or sometimes 4 degrees. So you can be an associate 1, associate 2, associate 3, associate 4. Or I think at Booz it was associate 0 and then associate 1, associate 2, associate 3. And that's that up or out, right? So you should always be progressing up. You should always go from associate 0 to associate 1 at your annual review, and then you should go to associate 2 at the next one. And your comp changes and your bonuses change as a result. And then when you get to associate 4, to just stay with the Booz example, if you don't manage to perform well enough to be promoted to whatever is next, then you're out. Then you're counseled out. Then in your performance review, basically the feedback will be, we're not sure you're ready to go to the next level. And as you know, we have an up or out policy, so you'll need to start looking for something else. And we're happy to support you with introductions to our clients, and they'll often have a kind of outplacement service built into the firm that leverages alumni of the firm for roles and different things like that. And so at least on the Booz alumni site, there's a very, very active employment, job posting, et cetera. So I hope that kind of answers the question. And feel free to ping me again or jump on verbally if not. And the second part of that question was, I was told consulting is a discipline similar to being a lawyer, where the more projects you take on, the better you get. So I wouldn't categorize it like that. So I don't want to say that's wrong, but I probably wouldn't categorize it exactly that way. And I don't really think it's even true for the lawyer part, where the sort of more is better. I think what makes you successful as a strategy consultant is, in the younger years of your career, it's 2 things. One is the consulting skill set. You just need to nail it and be able to do it very, the Excel, the PowerPoint, and that sort of bedside manner. You just need to be good at all three of those. Or if you can manage yourself, right, if you're not good at financial modeling, then you have to find ways with your project manager that you're not the financial modeling guy. So I've seen people kind of skirt that. You can do that, right? But in terms of content production and formulation of strategy, and that bedside manner piece, you have to be good at that, or you won't be promoted. And then the second part of that in the younger years is it's actually your what's the word I'm looking for? I mean, your ability to work extremely long hours late into the night on a regular basis under extreme amounts of pressure. So, and I know it's different. It's not the same at all firms. Some firms, they just like to do more with less. McKinsey's famous for, the guys really try to work, like 10-hour days. It's not 8-hour days, but 10, 12-hour days, but it's not 18-hour days. And they give less content, but from their point of view, better content. Booz, at least one of the partners I worked for, his perspective was pretty different. He wanted to give as much content as possible with the smallest team possible. And so I also, I didn't know if I'd have a good chance to mention it, but I mean, there was one project where I was the project manager. I had 2 consecutive all-nighters, and I am not exaggerating. And it was just we had overpromised on content, and we were just short on resources. And that was a lesson for me as a project leader, right? Because I had agreed together with a partner on what we would deliver and the time frame, and it got away from me. So I think that happens, and we paid the price, and we got it done, and the client was very happy. But 2 consecutive all-nighters, I would not wish that on anybody. So although it maybe sounds funny in that early part of your career, just your resilience and your ability to work hard under pressure for long hours, and not kill your teammates and not get upset with the client and all that kind of stuff, right? That ends up being a critical part of your success. And then later, what makes you successful is your ability to sell. It's actually pretty simple. You have to be able to manage the team, but you have normally such a strong cadre of well-qualified people on the team that you do need to set them in the right direction, but then they're self-sufficient, right? So it's really more about what differentiates you and makes you successful later in your consulting career is one thing, and that is how much you can sell. So yeah, I hope that answers that question. And I saw a thank you, so I guess it does. Anything else before we wrap up? Let's take time for one more, otherwise we'll wrap it up. Anything else? Okay. I guess we'll leave it there, and let me just conclude by saying, again, it was my pleasure having an opportunity to speak to you all, and my contact details here at the end. I do invite you to get in touch if I can be helpful to you in your job search. I do advisory work and consulting work, mostly in logistics technology for private equity and venture capital. So anything in that space as well, if you want to reach out, please feel free. My pleasure speaking with you all, and enjoy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Greg. And